Great.
Yeah, do record. Did you press record it?
Yeah, Michelle.
Oh, Michelle.
Daniel.
Sandy.
OG Rose headquarters with Sandy. We're in the kitchen tonight.
We're in the kitchen.
Sipping wine.
Yes, it's
It's Merlot and cookies and cream.
yes, it's actually a very good combination.
Could have been tea and tattle, but we thought
Tea
it was
and
wine and wine.
It was very nice for
like
Sandy
wine.
to come all the way from
Yes,
Sri Lanka.
From Sri Lanka. Like, this girl is amazing. She's here now, and we're just so amazed and excited.
Hooray!
So we're very,
And we
very
can, like,
happy
let off
about that.
confetti. Confetti
Yes.
needs to just drop down from
I'm
the
very happy to be in the OG headquarters.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanduni.
Tuning in
Miss
live
Mudiyanse.
from the kitchen where the magic happens.
Ah.
Yeah, where Haven has all of his bug snacks, where he's put eyes and on all the
vegetables.
tomatoes, on
Yes.
vegetables and different things. That definitely works out. So
And where Daniel contemplates the negation of the negation.
of the negation,
And
where
there's many other things.
the negation, where
Wow,
I
puts
take
on
a
the
toy,
dish holder.
where I take a toy unicorn and spin its head around to snap its neck. But since it's a toy, I'm not actually snapping its neck and actually proving that I'm a good person because it's sublating the negation of the negation into my ethical life. So
Indeed.
yeah,
I
I thought.
been waiting all day to say that.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good example of
It was
the
a very good
negation of the
example.
negation.
Indeed.
But y'all recently had a conversation with Mr. Javier on his piece and different things.
We did?
So I enjoyed listening to that.
Well, good.
What was Javier getting at in that piece?
Well, he was talking a bit about the present, kind of how there really is never a present because it's always some sequential movement of nows, right? There's
Right.
never a now. As soon as you say now, it's escaped. It's not escaped, but it's past you. It's passed through you, in a sense. So, I think he was really inspired to write the piece from the talk between Thomas Winn and Dr. Cadell last
Yeah, that's
on
good talk.
overcoming nihilism.
Yeah, in the Nietzsche series.
Yeah, on the Nietzsche dialogues. Cadell has a class coming up
Yep.
on Nietzsche and thus spoke Zarathustra.
Yep.
So that's going to be great. You should check it out. Go to his philosophy portal.
Oh yeah, the work that on the
I'm going to
Hegel.
insert my jingle. Cadell,
We didn't
I'm going to work on a
develop the
jingle.
jingle.
Is
For
that the
Stan.
Achieve Nothing? Is that the one?
Yeah, Achieving Nothing is
Achieving
Thomas
Nothing,
Winn's
right.
website.
Right.
Yeah.
We didn't do our jingle. Well, actually, not having a jingle would be because there's no jingle to achieve.
We negated the jingle.
Yeah, so we negated it by speaking about it in a non-jingle way.
Yeah.
And different things. So he's talking about the sequential of
something
present.
that came up was like the afterwards was kind of Javier kind of elaborate or like added on this idea of like the permeating subjectivity. That we kind of have this permeating subjectivity through the person, right? Who is the holder in a sense of this movement of time, right? We kind of are always the bridge between the past and the future. It's held within us. And then that was kind of connected with that kind of has to do with this idea of like the permeating subjectivity versus us being merely in a place of just subjects. If we allow ourselves to be in the permeating subjectivity, it allows for real encounter in the Buber sense. Because Buber talks about this himself. The individual has to do with the subject, the person has to do with subjectivity.
Right.
And so it moves from this idea of like just basically imposing our notions and maybe basically subjecting, just staying in the subject realm, subjecting and being subject to our notions, right? And we move away from that into subjectivity when we understand that we're actually very subjective even in our ideas for, like I said before, notions of who people are and what they are.
Right.
So it kind of, I think, in a sense, like, to kind of put in layman's terms, it's almost just a humility. Like, oh, right, there's so much I don't know about this other person. I may have my ideas, but I don't actually know fully who they are because it's always through the lens of my permeating subjectivity. So I thought that was good.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a funny dilemma when it comes to thinking. Because if you didn't believe in the thought that you were thinking, then you wouldn't think it seriously, and it wouldn't have any weight. But then your thought doesn't equal the thing. And so it is actually very difficult to sort of figure out in life the right way to hold a notion. Because there seems to be a holding it too tightly, and there seems to be holding it not enough, right? Like, if you had no idea who a person was at all, it would be very difficult to know what to say or what to communicate about. And actually, maybe the person would feel disrespected because you didn't have any idea who they were. Like, people want to be known, right? They'll say, like, oh, I want to be known. I want people to know who I am. But then at the same time, that means people want other people to have a kind of frozen notion about them in a way, right? Which creates a certain paradox. Because then at the same time, people are like, one of the reasons people will shout back, you don't know me, is in a certain situation is precisely because the person's notion about them did not change with how the person changed. So there's this interesting whole subject, I think, of often when it comes to epistemology, we simply talk in terms of you either know it or you don't, but there seems to actually be a kind of epistemological holding, a certain right grip to have that is not easily to determine. And I think when you're talking to Mr. Buber, there's something lurking there about kind of the right way to hold a notion so that the notion does not replace the thing. But also, you have to have a notion, like, why is someone a stranger? Someone is a stranger because you don't have any idea about them, right? But what is a way to oppress somebody? By having an idea of them that you expect them to conform to. So people don't want to feel like strangers, but they also don't want to feel oppressed in that sense. So for me, it's interesting that we never kind of teach this like epistemic grip or something like that. And Sandy spilled the wine everywhere. No, it's all right. She didn't know how to grip the glass.
No,
It was too light. That's a great example, Sandy. You know,
Yes.
the right grip to have on things. But I always find it interesting that the category, and I'll pass it on, the category of sort of epistemic grip is not discussed. We only discuss knowing or not knowing, but we really don't talk about like epistemic maybe grip or holding or ratio. You could even talk about a mathematical term, proportion, weighing is some, yeah, you could talk about dance, like light on your feet, but not too light on your feet. This is I think another example why artistic metaphors are very useful, because it's a delicacy that art always has employed to it for the aesthetic experience. But Augustine, with a Bold and Tim, we talk about weighing, like weighing values. Proportionality was a classical sort of notion. But for me, it's interesting to think about like epistemological hold or grip.
And the point you made about I versus it.
Yes.
When I sort of think about it in terms of language, I seems to have a sense of fluidity because I is more personal and we're constantly evolving, whereas it has a sense of finality, almost like it's finite, like it's reached sort of its optimum or its peak, and it has this fixed qualities, traits, attributes, or even a principle. When you sort of refer to something as it's defined, it has a definition, like quite literally. Whereas with I could be one thing today and something else tomorrow. It's constantly evolving or moving forward and evolving. And that sense of now and then and past and present sits quite differently between the two notions, because for it, present doesn't change much if it's fixed, if it's finite.
Absolutely.
Whereas for I, present's constantly evolving, and that's why we exist in moments, and moments are fleeting.
Oh yeah, I think in Buber, the difference between, like, if we were to say I and thou, and I some of them translate, I guess, is it I and you or something?
Yeah, in that
it's I or you.
Yes.
There is definitely different disclosures of time that come based between the I and it versus I and thou. And I think Buber, is in the conversation of a lot of those thinkers at the beginning of the 20th century, where time is becoming a rich philosophical notion, and obviously Heidegger, but then you have Bergson, you have Buber, where the way we relate to time, if from an existential standpoint of I and thou, is very different from I and it.
Right.
And I think it's to what you're saying, and there's something, there's actually something terrifying to time, if you take it seriously, because things change, and things are not what they are today, and they become something new. Now, there's also something exciting about that, but then you have, the Ozymandias, Schelling statue, look upon my works in tremble, and the level sand, and, everything eventually dies to time. But there's certainly an entirely different temporal disclosure that comes with those different existential statuses.
I think, like, from our discussion with Javier, what sort of really resonated with me was that we discuss so much about the present, right? We fixate on this idea. Yet, like you said, Michelle, the present is an accumulation of the past and the present. like quite literally, the past and the future, and it's constantly evolving. And while you could be physically present in a certain place or in a state of mind, you could be ruminating or dwelling upon a past event or a future event. But it's happening right now, so it's happening in the present. There's a sense of irony. It's almost paradoxical because we're here discussing something that happened yesterday.
Yeah, sure.
But we're in the present moment. We're in the OG Rose kitchen / headquarters, sipping wine and eating ice cream, discussing a paper written yesterday morning and a conversation that happened at 3 p.m. yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's why, and I think there's
So where's the present?
well, that's the thing. Where
The
is
present is the ice cream. It just doesn't have a bow.
Yes.
It just doesn't have a bow.
We need a bow on that ice cream.
Shoot.
Unwrap it. Yeah, basically, I think that's kind of just like the idea too that I think there was a line in Javier's paper about this idea that the present or like the future is always made from the fabrications of the historicity.
Yeah.
That makes me think a little bit of like your paper on memory, Daniel.
Sure.
Imagination and memory. And the point of the matter is like we use this material that we've kind of we use this material. I'm glad you like the ice cream, dear. That's wonderful.
Right,
I'm excited.
I do.
I'm excited to try. Yeah, I'm gonna have a bite too, and I'm very excited about it. Delicious. So we have this material of the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of jettisons us forward in a sense because everything we encounter in each successive now is sort of through it's almost like these lenses or something. I don't know, it's like the lens of the past or something that we see the future through. And it changes over time given our experiences. And yet at the same time, I guess what I mean to say is like it's unrealistic to think that we just have this sort of like blank slate, like and
It's
that's why
almost like the past dictates the future.
But I guess I'm thinking like, isn't that just kind of inevitable? Like, yes, you can live in the past in the sense that you focus on, and it usually has to do with attachment and desire, like we got into with our talk with Javier.
Absolutely.
Like you think about the past and like how the good old days and kind of like things you really wish you could have again or enjoy again or do again. So I think that's the thing that makes the past in a sense like problematic, that the future is always kind of comprised of the past. But the thing is, I don't think you can escape the past being the lens through which you see the future, because it's always like you're always building.
Right.
You're always, even the things you imagine in the future are based off of stuff you've already experienced or thought of or defined in the past. Does that make sense?
It's almost like what you form in the present comes to life in the future, because you sort of see its effectiveness or if its efficacy down the road.
Yeah.
It's never instant. But if you dwell so much on the present, I'm having ice cream right now, and I can only taste it after a few bites, but that automatically makes it the past, right? I'm eating it right now, but I don't sort of enjoy it simultaneously. Mm-hmm. I've got to savor it and think about it, and that takes time. So it's almost like the importance of the present is determined by what happens in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Much like the discussions we're having, or even the thinkers that we sort of read about, their work has been deliberated and been effective, or contemplated in our present, in the future, which is now and tomorrow. It didn't quite happen when they sort of wrote the material that they have written, or the literature that was written back then, because you don't reap the benefits right away, right? It's like it takes time to come into life.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So in that sense, you almost can't have a present without a past, because you can't enjoy the present as much without the past, or without dwelling upon the past. And that's why history is so important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the word dwell is funny, and I brought this up in the talk with Javier, but I didn't really clearly continue with actually fleshing out this point. But I think the word dwell is interesting because we can use it in a sense of dwelling, like lingering, right? Lingering on the past or something holding on to. But there's also the dwell that is literally to like make your home.
It creates a sense of attachment when you say dwell.
Yeah, it does. But then there's also just like the dwelling, like what's your dwelling place? Like where are you living? Like where is your abode? Where are you? Where is home for you? Where is home for you? Do you feel more And I think there's kind of this sense of being able to have home be the place that's constantly moving through you, that is the present, that then allows that to become not the attached lingering, dwelling, then not becoming an attachment and the linger in that sense, like dwelling in the lingering sense, but suddenly becomes where you are situated, where you are, like where are you located, where is your home.
Right.
Now I do think though that it is impossible to have a present without the past, and the present is always kind of like being brought in, the future is being brought into that, like every present is a future, right? That is like made present. But basically, yeah, I think the reason why I'm interested in talking more like kind of in the nitty-gritty of this language is because a lot of times people talk about being present, and I brought this up in our talk too with Javier, where it's like, just be present, and that's a great affirmation and great advice. But it's funny because it doesn't mean to like erase your past, like you can't anyways. That's impossible. It's impossible to somehow become suddenly a blank slate or something. And yet there is something strangely able, if you can have your past but not be like attached to it and not be possessive with it, then there is a way in which you get some clarity and sort of a freedom and liberation from your past or your future to really, as the phrase says, be present. Be present. So, anyways, these are some thoughts. What do you think, Daniel?
Well, usually when people say stuff like be present, I mean, don't worry, don't be thinking about the future or what you're going to be. They're saying like pay attention to what's going around you. The issue, of course, is that whatever you define as present is ultimately arbitrary. Like, our present right now is this kitchen. We could just as easily be in the living room. We could just as easily be upstairs. Like, whatever constitutes the present is in a way, it's usually arbitrary. Now, one could say be present as in be conscious and aware of what you choose to be in, but that's usually not what people mean. They almost mean a sort of like just be, right? Just be, But then it's kind of interesting because present is arbitrary, and ultimately that applies to time as well. Like, once we kind of pay attention to this now as opposed to the now 5 minutes ago when we were doing something else, like there's kind of like an arbitrariness to when we think about the present, which in of itself would suggest that when we are being present, it's in a way kind of it almost an act of self-deception, because none of us are really actually present. We might do it for 3 seconds as we realize we should be, and then we go back to thinking about something else. Your brain is always kind of operating.
Yeah.
So the question of the phrase when we say like, what does it mean to be present? That would mean, maybe it would mean something like to be fully engaged, to be fully not trying to escape. Maybe it means not to be hoping to be somewhere else. Maybe it means to be satisfied. Maybe it means stuff like that. But when we're trying to refer it into notions of time, like be present, what's very interesting is that it's basically impossible to think present. Because like right now this wine glass is, am I thinking about it or am I just focusing on it? Like, do you really think about something that's around, or do you just reflect on it, right? Like, there's a sense in which you only think about things in a very meaningful sense if they're not present at all, like that they're kind of abstractions and you have to integrate it with memory. That's like the most clear example of thinking. Mm-hmm. Well, that would mean thinking is always tied to memory.
Yes.
And memory is therefore always tied to past. Mm-hmm. And that would mean that the only time we think is when it's involving the past. And without thinking, the present cannot be meaningful.
Yes.
And that would mean that the present is only meaningful thanks to an act that is only possible because of memory and ergo the past.
Right.
And what's quite interesting is ultimately the distinctions, say, between past, present, and future are very, very kind of arbitrary. Really, in human experience, they all seem to be combined all the time. Yep. Arguably now, you could argue that future isn't. Like, we think the future, but we actually don't. Like, if we say, what's the future going to be, and you imagine yourself at 45, you're actually just imagining. You don't know what you're going to be at 45. Like, we call it thinking about the future when you think of yourself as where you're going to be at 45, but you're not unless you know, literally, that's what you're going to be at 45.
Yeah.
You're not thinking the future.
But,
future thought is usually just imagination, and we tend to get confused on the distinctions between memory, imagination, and thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of like your paper, thinking is not experiencing, like the idea that there's a way in which, thinking does, because, and actually thinking about the future, thinking about anything that is not yet in your experience is always a type of imagining.
Absolutely.
And that's where it's kind of like, it's okay because you're human and you will do that, but you should be fully aware that you are imagining. You know,
Yes.
you are imagining, and that's helpful because it can temper your certainty.
Yes.
It can temper your
That's
certainty.
exactly right. It will change your grip.
Yeah, it will hopefully loosen that. You know, it's an open hand, right? It's an open hand. You can receive. You can also. It's a place where things can, you know, be right. Like they either are able to be let go or to be held in the station of being on the palm of the hand,
Sure.
the open hand. But it's funny because we talked about this with Javier, that it's really interesting because we use the language of let go a lot, but really it was never yours. It was never yours.
Yeah,
So it
exactly.
is actually more accurate to say let it be, right?
Yes.
But I think that it is, yeah, I think that the certainty thing is very important here because,
True.
again, I think the idea, though I really appreciate deeply the idea of this like annihilating time and sort of this consumption, right? This like swallowing of time. There's also I think that's absolutely accurate. And it's a really wonderful and poetic way of understanding the movement of time through people. I just wonder, it's like with annihilating, we often think of it as like suddenly, you know, it being gone or something
Sure.
like that. And really, it's, thank you, love. Thank you, Sandy.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
Sandy is going around pouring everyone wine. So that's
Ching,
what's
ching,
last.
Ching ching. So it's
Yeah.
like, thank you, Sandy.
The ball's empty. So this is a really good OG talk.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The headquarters.
This one's for you, Javier.
This one's for
With
you.
wine.
The headquarters.
Our Molo inspired
Ice
conversation.
cream, Merlot.
Yeah.
Well,
But the point of the matter is, it's just the idea that we kind of, the idea of it being nothingness. Okay, it's weird because yes, there's nothing to it, and then but it's actually like kind of the opening of the eyes to see everything in a sense, right? So there's a strange way in which. It's really simply back to my point. This idea of being present is not this kind of like complete erasing, right? Or like complete, you know, eradicating, or like literally, how does a human kind of become nothing, you know, unless they literally like take away their life or something like that.
Well,
it's kind of an allowing for the sense of just to like hold that palm open, right? It's the ability to have the certainty be challenged, and we don't like that, but actually that there's something very freeing about that, because we often are so tormented in our certainty, right? Like we'll choose like literally torture. Because at least we can feel like we can be certain about, like we
Sure.
make some fabrication of certainty
Right.
that is completely uncertain. We have no idea, but we for some reason will cling to that, because even that torture is a fabricated certainty, and we feel more stability in that
Oh,
rather
yeah.
than let go and let be and actually realize how little we know. And that's why I think I brought up negative theology, but that there's a way in which when you realize like the God is the not God, it's like you don't actually know. Your concepts of what you think you know are not what you think it is. So it's again, I think there's a lot of freedom in that, and so therefore it's not about, again, nothingness it's not so much about like literally eradicating, because you know in the technical sense it's just like, well, let's blow up the entire universe.
Sure.
Woohoo, we like really accomplished nihilism then.
Sure.
No, it's this idea to be in the tension of existing with the non-existence, right? The non-existence is all of the things that are actually
Right.
uncertain. So that's really all I wanted to say. I hope that made sense.
I think it's quite interesting what you said, and the terminology sort of that you use about,
Yeah.
like the terms like freeing, let it be, letting go.
Yeah.
And this whole idea of being present, for me, is about being in control. You know, a certain sense of control. How much can you control? Like when you say don't sort of dwell so much on your past, you're really referring to the fact that it's out of your control. It has happened, and the outcome is whatever the outcome is, and you can't change it. As for the future, like Daniel said, it's completely your imagination. Yes, we might have desires for the future, and that's fine. Having a primitive sign of wanting is how the human mind works. That's all well and fine. But this whole idea of being present, and the fact that it's so glorified, is that people like to be in control of their lives. We like to sort of have some sort of control in what happens and how we live our lives. And sometimes
We want to feel in control. Right?
yeah,
We want the
sometimes I
feeling.
feel like the whole phrase of let it be is used as a way to sort of console ourselves when things are a little out of hand. Almost like,
And
well,
you don't have wine. Yeah.
you don't have wine.
Or the
I
cookies and
suppose.
cream ice cream, man.
Yes, and there is a sense of liberation and freeing this in knowing that you're not attached to the past or the future, because the future hasn't really happened and the past is out of your control. But you're always attached to what you want. And as long as you live, there is desire and there is a sense of want and need.
Oh, Sandy,
They go hand in hand.
actually, if you go to the 11th dimension, which can be accessed through the crepe myrtle, you actually get to a place of enlightenment and non-attachment. So just
go to the
just make sure you
That's
go
the reality. That's the reality of it.
That's why the kids were trying to climb it today. They know.
They know. The kids know.
The kids know.
My 11th dimension is my glass of wine. Yes. I'm enlightened.
That's my.
You know, I really like that we're having a talk about Javier's paper, who does the drunk interviews while we drink wine. You know, he really is permeating the OG Rose.
His subjectivity is permeating
Well,
the
we are
OG
sort
Rose
of
headquarters.
dismantling all of the existing illusions of how things have to be done, and
So we're really
the barricades are just
negation.
Yes,
different
yes.
things. Well, it's interesting. So there seems to be a distinction between annihilate and annihilate. And annihilate is kind of destroy. And the notion of annihilate, one of the things, like when we're talking about, like, if you really get that there is no present because the now is always gone just as soon as you talk about it, there's annihilation that occurs.
Bless you.
Yeah, that would be when I sneezed just now was annihilation of what I was trying to say, not annihilation. You know, when you annihilate your conception of time and you realize there is no present, the idea is by annihilating that, it then opens you up to an entirely new understanding of time and a new experience. And then you say, wait a minute, time really doesn't consist of a present. And yet, it doesn't really make sense to say that we live the past. You know, right? So this isn't the past, and yet at the same time it's also not the present, but it's also weird because we're future-oriented, and yet the future is imagined. So we're always heading into the future, which we can only imagine. There isn't really a present, because there's like a now that's always turning into another now, and the past is gone. So where are we? Like, where exactly are we? Other than the OG Rose headquarters. We can go into the living room, actually. I suppose that the kitchen's fairly together. So this is us. This is the commercial break. For more by OG Rose, visit our Amazon page where you can find The Conflict of Mind, The Piano Method, A Philosophy of Glimmers, for very reasonable prices. And it actually doesn't matter what the price is, because you should support you know, people you like listening to. So please, oh gosh, please, we have kids. You know, for more, please visit AmazonOGRose.com. Credit card.
Back.
Credit, yeah, wow, what a great commercial
Tuning in
break.
Live
From
the OG Rose headquarters, living room to be precise.
We've really covered some great ground. This is
For people that don't get to visit the headquarters quite often, they have a wonderful library and quite a pretty rocking chair that Daniel sat on at the moment. It's in teal colour. Yeah, it's quite nice and vintage.
I love this. See, we got to share our phenomenological space with you.
Yeah, because we do audio, we don't videos.
It's where the magic happens.
One day, maybe we'll get those fancy mics with those cool headphones and you know.
Yeah, basically all the OG Rose conversations are at midnight when the kids just went to sleep. So no, we can't do video.
At midnight, they'll be like, "What type of parents are you?"
It's like, turn the camera off. You know. But no, so it's very interesting to think about what exactly is time. You know, what is the human experience of time? Because there is no present. And so, and the future is imagined and the past is gone. And the past is remembered. And memory is not something that you can completely trust because it can change and different things. So what exactly are we talking about? There's a sense in which we create these neat categories of past, present, and future, almost to create a sort of kind of where we deceive ourselves into thinking that our understanding of time is more linear and simple, that we have a better grip on time than we actually do. You know, you can go back to Augustine, who's mystified by what time is, and even he, you know, is like, what is time? Time is this really weird thing. Yeah. Because we have these categories of time, which, you know, past, present, and future. But then we have the actual human experience of time, which doesn't seem like it has anything to do with those categories in any way whatsoever. And by annihilating the categories of time, the notion is that it opens you up to really taking seriously the human phenomenological experience of time. Similarly, you know, the hope of that paper, Thinking Here and Thinking There, is to annihilate the our ability to tell the difference between a memory and imagination, to realize that it's all just thinking there. Like, so the thought experiment of the paper is like, imagine, a living room with a pink elephant in it. Imagine your living room with a pink elephant in it. And if I were to ask you, is this imagined or your memory? You would say it was imagined, right? Because you would say, I know pink elephants don't exist. Yeah, from Dumbo, the drug elephant.
So we can be
The drug elephant from Dumbo movie.
I swear that's the brand for the kids' t-shirts from Sri Lanka. It's pink elephant.
Is pink elephant? Drug elephants from Dumbo?
No, just pink elephant.
Those friggin' drug elephants from Dumbo.
Drug
It
elephants
was
from
terrifying.
Dumbo.
You remember that vision when Dumbo got friggin' high or something? It was awful. Every Disney movie had some weird thing. Like the donkey people in Pinocchio. I mean, it's terrible. Or the little toaster clown nightmare. I mean, Disney's got some issues, man. Anyway, so you imagine a living room with a pink elephant. And I would ask you, is it imagined or is it a memory? And you would say, oh, well, it was imagined because there's a pink elephant in it. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, now imagine a baby elephant in your living room. And is that imagined or a memory? And you would say, well, it's imagined. Well, hold on. It is possible for there to have been a baby elephant in your living room and you just weren't there. Right. So it's actually possible that that's not imagined. It's just something, it's a possible memory, right? And then if I were to ask you to imagine your living room, and I would say, is this imagined or is it a memory? You would say, well, it's a memory. Well, it's interesting because the only way you were able to tell the difference between imagination and memory was in reference to a subject in the mental image. But the mental image itself in its very ontology did not change. It was still a mental image. Mm-hmm. And so the way that we tell the difference between memory and imagination is simply in reference to the subjects in those images themselves. But it's not like imagination and memory have any sort of change in the experience of them. We experience and we see them the same way. We just categorize them differently based upon the entities that are in that mental projection. Well, if we realize that's ultimately arbitrary, because here's the thing. Is it truly impossible for pink elephants to exist? Like, if you were to go to 11 dimensions, every possible universe, is there no possible universe where pink elephants exist? Maybe. But actually, if we say, yes, there's no possible universe where elephants exist, we're making an assumption, actually. We're ultimately, here's what we're doing. We're referring to our experience. We're saying, I've never experienced a pink elephant. I've never been in a universe where pink elephants are possible. Therefore, this is imagined. Well, then what you're doing is you're using your own experience as the reference point by which to kind of authoritatively say the difference between imagination and memory. But if you annihilate that and realize that that is ultimately arbitrary, because who are you to take your, experience as a reference point by which to define ontological possibility? Right. Well, then that opens you up to the strangeness of thinking. Like, thinking is very strange, and time is very strange once you annihilate those categories, and that they could make them new.
Can you just really quickly just give
No, whatever you're asking, no. No, I can't do it. I'm going to annihilate
as Javier would say, Barney style. Can you make it Barney style real quick, like for me?
I love you.
No.
Oh, you meant philosophically.
Yeah, no, I meant annihilating versus annihilating. Just in a sentence, please.
Annihilate would be to destroy.
Okay.
Annihilate would be to
negate.
Would be to negate. For me, negation is always tied to sublation. So, for example, when you negate something, you open new possibility.
Sure. But
annihilate is destruction, and there's no new possibility.
So, annihilate is essentially negate? Essentially?
Some people will use negate as annihilation. I would put the difference the following way.
Annihilation is to destroy.
Yeah, to get rid of.
But then annihilate is to...
Annihilate is, to me, when annihilate is being used, it's a form of the term negation.
Okay, that's what I figured.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense now. Yeah,
because you could say negate, but annihilate... would be to destroy, to open, like clearing a forest. I tie it to Heidegger. The way I took Winn to use annihilate was Heidegger's clearing. Heidegger will talk about like making a clearing so that there's kind of a new possibility, or like, for example,
opening up.
There's an opening up, where you like go to a forest and you cut down trees and now there's a grotto, like you've made a clearing. But in Heidegger, it's always interesting because clearing simultaneously conceal. Like, once you kind of cut down the trees in a forest and you make a grotto, you're now concealing the world where it was like an undisturbed forest. It's like gone. And also the grotto may conceal, like once you've created a grotto, you're concealing yourself from the possibility of, say, putting a house there because it's just a clearing. Right. So you don't see that. But then at the same time of concealing that, it also opens up that possibility. So Heidegger always has these very interesting multiple ambiguities on sort of concealment, opening,
all of those different stuff.
Yeah, well, it does seem like annihilating the term, though I'd probably have to ask Thomas Winn exactly like how he himself would use it in his own subjectivity.
Put it in the chat, Thomas. If you listen
Thomas,
to this, just put it in the
Thomas,
comments.
I hope you're listening, man.
We're drunk.
I love your.
Help us.
Putting it in. We're drunk. Flavor.
Thomas, I love your green screens. Thank you, man. I like your
They're
backgrounds
actually
you
good
pick.
green screens.
Yeah, well, I'm always like, can we just take a moment to like.
The green screens are impressive.
Acknowledge your green screen selections. It's great.
Most people's green screens are like their living room frozen.
But he'll pick a palm tree, man. Like he'll just pick like something kind of random. I think it's so wonderful.
Yeah, good job, Thomas.
So I don't know exactly how Thomas would use it, but it does seem like annihilating. Even in annihilating, there seems to still be elements of annihilation. Okay, because in annihilating, even if it's negate, there are things that have to kind of be pushed aside or like let go, or just thinking about clearing a forest in the Heideggerian sense, there is something that kind of, obviously these terms are very closely related.
Yes.
Annihilating seems to be like just a complete killing, like the complete death of something to be rebirthed, whereas annihilating seems to almost be like labor or something, right? There's kind of
there's the weird thing about it is the same act could be either. So for example, I could remove the roof off of a house without any plans of what to replace it with, and maybe I just do it out of rage. Like I just destroy the roof of my house. But then I could also destroy the roof of my house for the sake of putting a new roof, or to create like a glass ceiling so that we could see the stars at night. And if I were to do the latter, wouldn't that be nice? That is romantic. I was proud of that. Let's do it. The latter would be, the latter would be more on the side of annihilating, whereas annihilating would be more the first. But both involve the removal of a roof, but they have a different sort of phenomenological orientation, and that's why so much of this does indeed come to the phenomenology and the towardness and awareness and all of these different things.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was a little aside.
No,
but
it's important.
I wanted to talk just a little bit about like the nitty gritty. Again, I'm going to use that term way too many times.
Well,
people are going to think
they're going to want you to annihilate the term.
Nitty gritty.
No, annihilate.
Sure.
Nitty gritty. No, but to your point.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of just parse those terms.
Well, again, it is very difficult because the act can be the same. Like, literally can be the same. Like, removing a roof can be an act of annihilation, or it could be an act of annihilation. Like, realizing you are nothing, in one way could be annihilation, because then you're like, like mentally unhealthy, because you're like, I'm nothing, and you mean it in a sort of like bad way. But then in another way, you could say, wait, I am nothing. I'm free.
Yeah.
So it can be the same. This is why it's tricky. It can be the same sentence, the same expression, but in one way it's annihilation, in another way it's annihilation.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me of like the Emily Dickinson poem that Javier actually speaks about sometimes.
I like Emily Dickinson.
Where it's about like being nobody, and how that was very freeing for him actually. And that's very true. Like, it's funny how that same sentence for somebody at a different at a different place on their journey could see that as like, be forlorn about that. Like, I'm a nobody, and that's like, I don't matter.
Yeah.
But for where he was at with his own journey, it was very liberating, because it's like, oh right, like I'm just, you don't actually have to, there's sort of a sense of like, I don't have to be a particular person, or I'm actually a nobody, like the way that Emily Dickinson words it is obviously going to be a lot more poetic and beautiful, but the idea is just that simply, it's kind of this idea of like how maybe introverts could understand this more, but the idea of like wanting to just be able to go somewhere and just sort of be able to be a nobody in a crowd, like you're not having to like put on some pretenses or have to perform or anything, you can just kind of be.
Yeah, there's that part in Stations 11 where the girl talks about like the freedom of anonymous, where they go somewhere and they're just anonymous. That was in So no, another way to perhaps get the distinction is in the paper Flip Moments of Conflict in Mind, where we talk about like an event occurs that kind of reaches backwards and changes the meaning of all occurred, as if it was always going to mean that. So for example, if raising interest rates saves the U.S. economy, it will reach back in time and be as if it was always a good decision. But if raising interest rates destroys the American economy, it will reach back in time and make it as if it was always a bad decision. So like that's there's always this kind of transformation of the meaning of time and choice relative to the outcome. In a similar way, like in Hegel, if you ever stop the phenomenological drama or journey, then it's as if it was always a process of annihilation, whereas if you continued the journey to the end, it was always a process of annihilation. So like if you don't see, if you stop halfway, then it's as if it was always just going to annihilate you and it was never a good use of time. But if you make it all the way, it suddenly turns into annihilation or negation sublation. So another reason why the terms are so related is because there's always a potential flip moment that's going to turn it into the other. Like you could literally be engaging in annihilation, and then suddenly make a choice that turns it into always being annihilation. And that's where you have that flip moment contingency element that makes it confusing.
I think if we branch it into a theological perspective, I think that annihilation and annihilation do work in sync, basically. If we think about it, if we think about the idea of even just like the ego, for example.
Sure.
And maybe this is not theological. I'm just talking about sort of metaphysical dimension. Okay?
Well, there are some areas where they're going to practically be the same.
Because
even if not technically.
The conversation, but should we not put the ice cream in the fridge? It's melting.
Or in the freezer?
We're trying to annihilate it so that we have a clear metaphoric distinction.
I was thinking we could, if it was just a completely liquidated, we could
it could be a swimming pool. That's a sublation.
Swimming pool.
But yeah, the ice cream is saved now, so it is not annihilated.
And we got to discuss our podcast name, Sand and Shell, bringing you to the Sand and Shell
from the sandbox of the OG Rose headquarters.
Yes, we'll be literally just us sitting in that small sandbox.
It'll be called Sand and Shell.
Yeah,
wow.
Sand and Shell.
That's
because I'm
actually
Michelle, but my nickname is Shelly by my family.
The Nihilation.
Yeah,
so
that's much better.
But no, I think with the Nihilation, it's running. Yeah, it's running. It's sublated.
Have ice cream.
It's sublated. I can put it in the freezer.
Honestly, the fact that this is liquid, I can just drink it. I'm just gonna just drink it.
It's not
the
ice cream was not annihilated. It was annihilated into a milkshake.
That's right.
She likes some ice cream.
This was
put it away.
Yeah, it was sublated.
This was sublated. My ice cream, which was solid, melted.
It was sublated into a drink.
And was sublated into a drink. A milkshake, well, a little more liquidy. It's very nice and drinkable.
See, that all works out. But no, I think when we talk about annihilating being, annihilating time, annihilating categories between memory and imagination, this is for the sake of opening one up to the strangeness of, say, thought. That whole paper on thinking there and thinking here was really about we don't find thinking strange anymore. We don't find it strange anymore, and it doesn't surprise us. And thinking it is very, very weird that you can have images of something not here in your facticity while you are in your facticity, that you have things in your head that are invisible. It is very, very strange that your entire way of giving meaning to the present is via a past that is not here in the present. And there is, in accordance with a present that is always annihilated by a now, that is toward a future you can only imagine. The incredible strangeness of the human operating in a given moment is lost to us because we don't annihilate those categorical distinctions enough to be surprised by what they refer.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's very true. I wonder, because somebody who may be less acquainted with this terminology may find it rather abstract or something like that.
Sure.
But I think the very concrete, the concrete things about it's very practical. It's very practical actually to understand this idea of the fact that the present is always sort of moving through you, because just very simply, then we understand that life is actually of movement. It is a movement.
Sure.
And in a sense, you're kind of you are in a sense the conductor by what you choose to pay attention to,
sure.
and what you choose to sort of think about even, and.
But we're never in control of that choice, are we?
Do you think
what
so?
We think about. Yes, we think about a lot of things, but you ruminate into certain thoughts.
Well, you can't always control just what pops up into your head, right? The word papaya popped into my head randomly, right? It's sort of there's some free association that's kind of happening, it seems, in the mind, where you can't always control what you end up thinking about. But do you cling onto it? Do you fixate on it? Do you really clutch it, grasp it and really kind of hold it onto it like Gollum or something like that?
Sure.
I mean, there is something to that. There's kind of a Gollum effect to whatever we try to hold on to, whatever we try to possess, right? It possesses you, right? You're truly possessed by it in a sense.
True.
And I think though the understanding of movement, if you understand that time is a movement, perhaps it could make us more fluid. I bring up in our talk with Javier the idea of time as a river,
Sure.
You know, it's always flowing. It is always moving. And so, a simple illustration, but at the same time, perhaps that can be quite, in a sense, strangely empowering in our acknowledgement of our inability, right? Or our
Sure.
impossibility, right? Our impossibility of ever having some sense of like the present, right? If we talk about that,
Sure.
just to, not to harp on that too much, but then we can understand this idea of it be the fact that it's empowering is the idea that, wait a second, even whatever I'm ruminating on can be carried downstream,
Sure.
can be carried downstream if I allow it. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, the moment there's a category, we should be suspicious. And so, for example, like we have categories like free will, determination, you know, these like very determinism, these kind of very broad categories. But really, if you pay a lot of attention to how your brain works, or just pay attention to really how you experience time, like that deep, careful phenomenological analysis, you start to realize how problematic and impoverished these categories are, just like what Sandy was saying. Like we are often, we have choice, but it tends to often be relative to something we didn't choose. Like a
Right,
thought enters
right.
your head you didn't choose, but then you can choose what you do with it. Like you may
Yeah.
not have you didn't choose your genetics, but you can choose what you do with those genetics. Like in the same way that the hard categories of memory and imagination is a problematic thing, like very hard categories because they blur and they mix. There's, you know, in some respect, time, you know, you were talking about free association. It's almost like all of time free. Everything relates free association, like memory and imagination freely associate, like past, present, and future freely associate. Like we are these beings of perpetual free association that you can't say is random. You know, association is not random. There is a logic for why the association occurred, but the logic is very hard to isolate into very rigid categories because it crosses categories so constantly. So, like, we tend to, our brain, but the problem is the brain loves fixed categories because it makes the world understandable, and we want to survive, and, you know, we're in the business of trying to stay alive, and fixed categories give us a sense of safety, and it feels easier to stay alive. But really, the issue is that fixed categories like free will or determinism, it's not really that. It's more like directionism is what I want to say. Is like, yes, humans have agency, but it tends to be to set a direction of variables they didn't choose.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up. I'll just say really quick, because one of the things I kind of wanted to get to in our talk with Javier on this idea of like unbecoming and, you know, just talking about the present and time and nihilism and stuff, was this idea, we talked about desire a bit in the talk, and one of the things that I think is not always understood is the nuance of desire.
Sure.
Because basically, like, we kind of just assume that, okay, well, if somebody didn't do something, it's because they didn't want to.
Yes.
That's so
Simplistic.
That's so simplistic. There are a lot of things that a person might be desperately wanting to do, but they can't.
Sure.
Or
sure,
they or make the decision not to for a particular reason. But it doesn't change the fact that they had that desire, that they had that want. But perhaps they have to relinquish that want.
Well, if
and-
we think of annihilation as a heuristic tool, you can basically take it to like all of these different issues and just saying our notion of desire is stupid because it's not so simple.
It's just, right, exactly. Like the idea of it just, we make it in such a strict binary. You know, if somebody did something, they wanted to. If they didn't do something, they didn't want to. And this has very practical consequences because we, you know, Sandy and I talk a lot about like, you know, communication and, you know, through social media and technology and stuff like that. And it can be very difficult not to read into, you know, oh, if somebody responded or didn't respond. And, you know, oh, like if they didn't, maybe that means they didn't want to. But that's just simply not in touch with like the nuance of reality, which is that people, you know, have multiple motivations, and there's kind of that
They've got their own life.
They've got their
as
own
well.
life. They might be going through something. You
Yeah.
never know. You just don't know. There's so little one knows about another human mind.
But we're never okay with not knowing.
I guess that's
Sure.
that's the truth.
We just, like this whole notion of letting things be, sometimes you've got to be okay with not knowing. Like
Yeah.
the lack of correspondence creates anxiety because
Yeah.
we assume that they deliberately chose to do that, but that's you being so self-centered
That's true.
in your mind that,
Yeah.
you know, you make it about you, but it could just be them having a bad day, or, you know,
Sure.
inability to sort of communicate at that time, or to be quite present in their response to you, or they think they'd be better attentive to whatever they're responding to at a different time.
Sure.
But we never think that. And I think this whole notion of like sort of desire and attachment and just wanting things, it's okay to want things, it's okay to desire, but you just have to believe that you have to live your desire to the fullest without sort of being very attached to the outcome, and knowing that the possibilities of all these outcomes will exist regardless of your desire changing. Like, we have different desires every day.
Sure.
We don't necessarily pursue all of them.
Sure.
So then it's very much a fleeting want. Our wants change. Our desires change. So why do we often fixate so much on the outcome of these desires when we don't even know that we want this forever? You know, that the time frame could sort of, you know, elapse or change, or it could be very short-lived or very fleeting. You know, it could just be, you know, a pleasure-based desire. Like, I want some ice cream at this very moment, and I've had it, and that's it. But if I don't have it, it's also okay.
Right.
You know, that's okay. So why?
No, it's not. It's really not.
Yeah, not having ice cream is pretty bad, Sandy. Let's be careful with your example. You're making a lot of claims.
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's sort of in your head how much you heighten the situation, right?
Sure.
The magnitude and the the magnitude of the situation is entirely in your head.
Yeah.
If you think to yourself, well, I don't have ice cream, but I'll have some fruit, which is also sweet,
Oh, sure.
and it could compensate for your temporary desire of wanting some pleasure-based outcome or some comfort.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying because
So the outcome has changed,
Sure.
and you've sort of, you've compromised your desire, but at the end of the day, you've gained some sort of satisfaction.
oh yeah.
But if you so much fixate on the actual object, and this again,
Object.
you could connect it to sort of this I and this it, you know, this sort of being rigid in your wants and desires and being very fixated and uptight about it is often what creates a sense of conflict in the mind. So perhaps having a sense of fluidity and thinking that it's okay if your desire changes into a different form. Even when you talk about the river, the river takes different shapes and forms as it flows. You know, it goes through rocks, it goes through waterfalls, through wells, you know, it takes all those shapes. But it's still the river, you know, it's still immense. And its magnitude doesn't change even when it goes through those small loops and, you know, those spaces.
Right.
It takes that form, but it is bigger than all of that it embodies.
Yeah.
Right.
It is magnanimous, you know, and sometimes I feel like desire is only a form of suffering if you make it quite accurate and quite precise. If you let it be fluid, if you let it be compromised, not in a bad way, obviously, if you are able to make peace with the fact that you have the ability to desire more than achieving it or attaining it or possessing it, you'll be content. And that sort of creates a positive connotation to the terminology of desire than all the negative connotations that it leads to suffering and this sense of possessiveness and attachment. So I suppose in the end of the day, you know, it creates good deliberation and conversation, but it's perspective. It largely is perspective. And it can be very much negative or positive. That's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Well, it's
love that.
interesting in the second book of the Space Trilogy with Lewis and the starts with a P, Parlage or whatever.
Do you have that in your famous OG Rose?
Oh gosh, it's
library?
right over there.
It's right
yeah.
over there.
That's
Oh, right.
one of his best books.
The C.S. Lewis section.
But you know, basically when they're on Paralandria, which is supposed to be basically a representation of Eden, and there's Eve there, and she's talking to the main character or whatever. Rat starts with an R, and basically her operation at one point, he says, "I'm tired," and she just lays down and falls asleep, and likewise she operates in a manner where when she desires something, she just does it. It's like it doesn't mean anything. She just does it. Yeah. And what Lewis is suggesting is that one of the ideas of what makes Eden and paradise is that if you're sleepy, you just take a nap. Like, you desire a nap, so you do. And the notion is that desire, one of the things that make us wonder about desires is actually because we're in a social element. We're socially conditioned, and we wonder if we should desire this, and what will other people think if we desire this, and should we be, like, what is the meaning of this desire? Whereas if you're alone in Eden, what Lewis is saying is that desire is just the operating principle. Like, you have to have, if there was no desire, there'd be no operation. And the difference between basically wanted desire is that desire becomes the desire in this way that we are describing it becomes the social understanding of your wants. and you also examining your wants in terms of their social implications, and that's where all the pain begins. Like, we literally don't, like, if you literally are just alone in a room, and or if you're Eve here in Eden and you want to take a nap, you just lay down. It's basically almost like irrational not to. That's what Lewis is saying. Like, when Eve is tired, it's literally irrational not to just stop everything she's doing and take a nap. It's like it would be irrational not to, right? And so what's interesting is the whole idea of there being a separation of desire and rationality emerges with the social conditioning, when you also are kind of looking for a justification for the desire. What Lewis is suggesting is that in Eden, you don't worry about a justification. You're free from the worries about a justification for your desire. They're just the way you make a choice, and that you operate. So I think a lot of what you're getting at starts coming. What actually is happening is we're reflecting on our wants in a social condition.
Right.
And that's when we become kind of confused about it. Right. Because we're reflecting on them, not just simply on us to them, but how other people will interpret them and what they mean in a social setting and all that other stuff.
So you're saying that, like, it's not that complicated. If you have a desire, just do it?
To act upon your desire.
But the complicated thing is that it's in a nexus, right?
But now it's in a nexus. Like, that would be after the fall and different things.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we're talking in Eden.
I understand.
You know.
And this is the thing. Desire is not bad. And like, you know, the desire itself, it's kind of like, it's like sex itself is not bad.
Sure.
Sex is good.
Sure.
It's just that it's always about the orientation, the how, the why, all of those questions that get into the fact that we're actually always in sort of some sort of like nexus.
Yeah, and what Lewis is kind of just saying is that there had to basically be want in paradise, because otherwise you couldn't operate. There would be no...
I've always thought about it too, like, how could there even be, if we think about it from this, like, from a Christian theological perspective, isn't there some sort of sense of, like, if there's love for God for his people and people for God, that is a type of wanting
Yes.
to express love,
Yes.
experience love.
Yes.
So we can't just vilify want, because it's like, well, then how can we ever understand want is good as oriented toward God? Does that make sense?
Well, yes.
You just
The issue where it becomes difficult is when precisely once there's a quote-unquote fall, and want has to be situated in the social nexus amongst other people, and then suddenly you could say it turns into desire, or, you know, if you wanted to make different distinctions. And then there is such thing as bad desires, because you can covet your neighbor's wife, you can envy, you can do sinful things, which would be like where you want a disordered good, right? And so, but that's another example of annihilating a category where we just say desire is always bad, right? You say, well, you annihilate it. It's like, no, sometimes it's good. Well, the moment you do that, the reason we don't like annihilation is because it complexifies.
Yeah, exactly.
And now you have to think about it.
Exactly. It opens it up to, like, the bothness. Like, there's a lot of times there's bothness. And I think that's really important to understand with desire, too, and want, is that somebody can both desperately want to do something, but also not want to, because they may understand, like, potential
That's
consequences of something, or, you know, the fact that, well, just because something is desperately wanted, it may not necessarily be the right thing to do necessarily, or the right thing to pursue. Now, it might be perfectly fine to desperately want it, and even to fulfill that, to even get kind of what one wants in that situation, but It's simply that I think when we talk about this idea of the relation to other people, right? There's so much that is there's again, because our brains want to have certainty, we feel more comfortable in that, and definitely it's oriented toward our survival. We jump to the certainty of just deciphering people's wants or lack thereof.
Yes.
Because of what they do or don't do.
Yes.
And we also can fear or be concerned about what people might think about ourselves, or what we do or don't do, and what it might say about our wants or not, or and say about our wants or lack thereof. You know, it's sort of strange. It's like we really want, in a sense, it's strange because the whole topic of want shows kind of an anxiety in the place of uncertainty. But if we realized how much is uncertain, even time itself, even thinking itself, like it's weird. It's almost like how Alex Ebert will say, like, you didn't go far enough with, like, your whatever it is, like, you should go further. You should go further with your anxiety or whatever it is. Like, let yourself go almost insane. It's almost like that's a similar idea where you almost have to kind of, like, allow yourself to realize just, actually, okay, you felt very very anxious with this little bit of uncertainty, let me inundate you with the fact that all of reality has this huge aspect of uncertainty, and actually it almost like restores you somehow to be free, like, oh, actually that's right, like I there's so little I actually can be certain about, so why am I so just absolutely like sure that this interpretation I have of somebody, you know, sending an emoji or not, like why am I going to be so fixated on like and just completely sure that this is what it means when you have no idea, you know? There's so much that one doesn't have an idea about. Now that could be taken into the extreme where we never affirm anything, right? It's like, well, I just don't know, so I
Right, I'm a kitten.
I'll just be playing with a yarn ball all day. Yeah. But, you know, of course, there are going to have to be affirmative things. But the affirmative always has to be in dialect with the negation. We certainly don't emphasize, you know, almost like negative thinking in a sense. Because, well, basically, like a lot of, like you're saying, survival and institutions and fabric of society kind of relies on even just the illusion of certainty, basically.
Well,
which,
I mean,
there's a place for those things, and that's why there's a dialect between the certainty and uncertainty. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of I feel like the way that Winn is using annihilated in the term is actually how Derrida meant to use deconstruction. You know, for him, deconstruction was affirmative, like that where we are deconstructing, say, our certainty about the meaning of an emoji precisely so that we're open up to possibility. Like for Derrida, deconstruction was the Heideggerian clearing, and I would be curious if Mr. Winn thinks there is differences between annihilating and deconstruction as Derrida intended it, not as deconstructionists intended. Deconstructionists mean something, I think, different from Derrida. Derrida himself. But Derrida absolutely viewed deconstruction as affirmative. Because, you know, if you tear down your certainty, then you affirm the uncertainty of the universe. And since the universe is uncertain, you affirm the universe. If you affirm a universe where there is certainty, you're affirming an illusion. So there's a funny way in where deconstructing certainty is how you affirm reality. You know, likewise, when you know, if we go back to the language of annihilate, when you annihilate the idea that, say, desires are always bad, well, then you affirm reality, because in reality there are good desires and bad desires. When you annihilate the clear categorical distinctions between past, present, and future, you actually affirm the real world, because in the real world these three categories are always blurring together, you know, in human experience. When you annihilate the clear distinction between memory and imagination, you affirm the reality that these categories actually blur. So whenever you engage in annihilation of what is ultimately an arbitrary distinction for the sake of you affirm reality. But here's actually the problem.
Yeah.
The reason we created these categories is because reality is unthinkable. It's too complex. It is too difficult. So what's really weird is we created these categories precisely because we can't understand everything. So we had to create categories to understand it. But funny enough, just like Hegel talks about, you have to eventually get to the place where you deconstruct the categories to move to the next phase in the phenomenological journey. Mm-hmm. And then you create new categories that you'll eventually annihilate, and the new categories you eventually annihilate, and you have to keep doing that. So annihilation has to always be a central component of one's intellectual development, because there will always eventually be a point where it is needed to deconstruct an arbitrary distinction that was necessary to progress thinking, but now if it continues to be present, it will restrict thinking. What once enabled thinking will eventually restrict thinking if it is not annihilated at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Something comes to mind. I think that this can be very helpful, just simply too in relationships, right? Where it's like, well,
yeah.
I'm just, you know, unfortunately, it often becomes like a power battle, like a power dynamic, right? Of like, who's right? Well, if you understand this idea of like of annihilation, and it's actually time, the fabric of reality in a sense is has this element of annihilation, right? Then we can really kind of let that permeate into all of the aspects of our lives and relationships, etc., where we really do let go of our assumptions, we let go of our judgments, you know.
Absolutely.
And sort of allow, instead of just being very quick to accuse the person of being wrong or I'm right or this, it's like, well, there's a step back to that and an allowance to say, well, maybe what I think is not actually reality, or is not in touch with what the person's trying to do, and so I don't know, I mentioned it a bit ago, but it's just the word humility does come to mind. I feel like this can't help but kind of, in again layman's terms, kind of bring a sense of epistemic humility,
Sure.
To the conversation and to one's actual practical experience of reality and their relationships, and whether that's with family, romantically, their coworkers, etc., to sort of to step back and sort of not be so certain about what one feels so certain about.
Well, if you're not thinking and assuming, what are you doing? When you
Right.
discuss relationships and any sort of relationship, romantic, family, like you said, work, colleagues, if you're not thinking, if you're not assuming, what are you doing? That's...
Well, that's actually
that's-
getting at something very important, like we were saying at the beginning. Like, you have to believe what you're thinking.
Yes.
Otherwise, you
So-
wouldn't think it. That's why that's the epistemic grip problem.
Right.
But maybe there could be this sense in which, like, yes, it's true. Like, we kind of only can operate in some part. In some way, there's still going to be assumption there. In some way, there's
Right.
going to be this strange thinking, as Daniel referred to. But there's a way in which you kind of, like, are not quick to impose that on the other person. Like, you're going to think it probably, yeah. But it's sort of like, I'm not going to just take that and, like, lambast the person or plaster them with my
So how
imposition.
you sort of project it. That
How you
again
project it.
comes back to the grip.
Yeah.
So do you have a grip on your thoughts, and do you project versus do you express? And that's a very thin line.
Sure.
And
And kind of
with-
getting curious with that versus just sort of assuming that
But
is
thoughts are
certainty.
fleeting, right? So
It's true.
it's almost like we can't help it but think and assume, but it's more like how much we let our thoughts consume us.
Yeah.
Well, it
Yeah.
would almost seem that there's a difference between assumption and abstract. Like, you have to
Right.
abstract a pattern from your experiences in order to make it intelligible.
Right.
Whereas it would seem like assume is where you decide that pattern is fullest reality, that that map equals the territory per se, that
Right.
deduction is the truth. So we can't help but abstract a sense of a pattern.
Right.
In order to make it intelligible. If there's a sense of intelligibility, there has to be the sense of a pattern. But we don't necessarily have to assume that the pattern is the whole of the situation. We don't have to assume that the map equals the territory. That seems to be the second step. That's a problem.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true.
But
So there's always
that again just speaks to the need to annihilate these clean categories, because you have to assume. It's not going to be enough to say don't assume, because we're all going to do it. Like
Yes.
people like don't be judgmental. In a sense, that's
What does
true.
that even mean?
Yeah, you have to judge.
You have to.
It's just, we have a paper where we make a distinction between judgment and assessment, but basically it's impossible not to judge. So what do we mean?
assess and then we judge.
yeah, so right, and so there is a way in which, like, even to use language is a type of judgment, right?
Yes.
Oh,
You have to
absolutely,
judge that this term
Yeah.
is the term to describe,
Exactly,
and so on
exactly.
and so forth.
So yeah, it's strange to even talk about these things, right? Because it's like, well, we shouldn't really be like, assumptive and judgmental and sort of imposing our ideas or notions of the person on the person. But you inevitably will be working in the space of the bothness, right?
Yes.
There's a judgment and a non-judgment that are working in a dialect with one another, right, in order to have a more open and hopefully, like, just a better relationship. I mean, that's the goal, right? Like, the reason why we even talk about philosophy and really get into these terms and things like that is because hopefully that could help real everyday life, etc., etc. But yeah, I like that. I think that's good, Sandy. I like the pushback and this idea that, like, well, we are actually always are going to be working with some sort of assumption. That's true. We're assuming that when I say
we
the
can't
word,
help it. It's an impassive.
yeah,
act.
we're assuming that when we say these words that I'm speaking that are coming out of my mouth right now,
Yes.
that people can understand English, right, or understand
Right.
what I'm saying.
Yes.
And it also has this whole idea that I always come back to, that we could be saying what we want to say, but people hear what they want to hear.
Yes.
Sure.
Because there is this level of assumption, judgment,
So that-
social context, all of that applies to whatever you hear. You hear it from your perspective, never from the speaker's perspective, right?
Yeah. So then do you think that the assumption in the negative sense, where, like, people are imposing on other people their notions, their ideas, and even their judgments, like, how does this work then? Like, is so there's still the assumption, right?
Yes.
But is it the awareness that you have that assumption that then allows you to be more open to not the imposition of that assumption?
Yes, the awareness and perhaps the curiosity of not fully knowing what the discussion is about, or sort of, you know, if there's a sense of newness in what's being deliberated, then you pay attention without making it personal, because you don't know it enough to make it personal. So there's always that too. But it's very easy to assume things because it happens indirectly. You know, that's our first instinct. That's sort of how the reflex of the mind works. We assume this, that's how we relate to things. If we personalize it only is that we can relate to it, or else we can't. Because if you haven't experienced it and you want to relate to it, you assume, and then you sort of apply it to a situation that you think would be ideal in your life. And then automatically whatever is being discussed becomes a personal idea. And moving on from that is when you sort of form your judgment / assessment.
So,
Then again, judgment and assessment also goes in hand. Only if you know to sort of differentiate between the two can you say, right, I'm sort of judging or actually assessing, you know, the pros and cons, the different the outcomes of this argument / idea.
It's it almost sounds like what you're saying, Sandy. Like, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the awareness and curiosity can then almost make one's assumption, which is kind of inevitable. You can never really completely not have any assumptions. Again, using language as a type of assumption, okay? But just even that awareness and curiosity can then almost make it more become an internal, like an inner work or something, to kind of cultivate more of your own fuller understanding or something.
Yes.
Versus it just be assumption projection. Right,
Yes.
like assumption projection, which then literally just completely obscures your ability to see the reality of the other person and have
It's
a real
almost
encounter in the Buber sense, right?
It's almost like if the hat fits, wear it. You know, with the ideas and the way things are discussed. Because as much as you sort of assume things, with assumption comes the level of it becoming personal. It just happens indirectly or impassively. It has to become personal for you to sort of understand it, to sort of apply it in your mind to a situation in your life. That's the only sort of way that we actually remember these philosophies to a large extent. That's why we use examples.
We want it to be relatable,
Yeah.
Well, a few things. Basically, there must always be any idea, any thought, any action must always have in the back pocket annihilating element.
Right.
Like, the moment you assume something, you must always hold it. It's this notion of epistemic grip.
Yes.
Hold. Like, how much do you hold it? How tightly do you hold it? And so there always has to be an annihilating principle. You have to, in a sense, assume, because otherwise nothing's intelligible. Like, the issue is overfitting. Like, where you overfit your assumption and you say, okay, the person did X, they will therefore always do X. You know, the moment you're making projections from the assumption, that's when you seem to get in trouble. So a lot of it has to do with underfitting, overfitting from computer science. I mean, basically, you know, with that talk on Tracia, the talks with Lorenzo, philosophy tends to use metaphoric structures that are from the Enlightenment, and they're very either or, whereas what you really need is investment metaphors. Like, for example, where you say, okay, so you think that this person will always do X. Do you think that so much that you're willing to put in 100% of your portfolio, 70% of your portfolio, 50% of your portfolio? Like, you have to start breaking it down by percentages. You know, we say, that's where we get in trouble, is we don't realize that epistemology or thinking always ultimately has to come down to almost investment metaphors.
Right.
Like, it's okay to, you have to, in a sense, assume, like, even when it comes to saying you shouldn't assume what the person's going to do in the future. Well, if you tell them, let's have lunch at McDonald's at 2, if you show up at McDonald's at 2, you are assuming they're going to be there, that you can trust them, right? So there's always, these categories always blur. But it also varies relative to the potential consequence. Like, if you go to McDonald's and they don't show up, you can still get lunch, and it's not a big deal. So you may go even if you have reason to think that they won't show up. Yes. But if it's, say, for example, meet me in New York, and let's, like, you know, meet up there and spend 3 weeks together, and you may say, well, I've had experiences in the past where this person is flaky, so no, I'm not going to go to New York. So the intensity of the situation will also transform your investment strategy, you know, because basically what we're describing with assumption is a certain mental investment strategy.
Right.
But when people talk, you see, this is the problem. Like, we basically have to annihilate, if we keep using deconstruct, annihilate, our entire metaphoric structure by which we think of decisions and assumption epistemology. We're using a very outdated kind of epistemological model, which is very either or.
Like floppy disks?
Like floppy disk. We're basically using floppy disks when we should be using network, like, network thinking or different
They're
things.
very effective.
The floppy disk did work.
They did the job.
They had
Yes,
the
they-
numbered munchers game in Oregon Trail. You would
yeah,
plop those
man.
in the friggin' Macintosh, and
Good
you would
times.
and you would die of
Dysentery.
dysentery. You would just die. You'd hit the start new game, and it'd be like you died of dysentery. I didn't even get to the store. I just died of dysentery.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I got 700 pounds of food, and my family's starving, and I can only take 5 pounds back. Okay, great.
What a game, man. Oregon Trail.
Yeah, it was people lived it. It was the
They
American
must
dream.
be very offended.
Yeah, that was
like if the-
definitely an
If like the
offensive game.
pioneers could look like kind of seen to the future, like these kids are playing
Are
a
playing
computer
our
game about
misery.
our misery.
Misery. They are playing our video game. They have video gamed our misery. But no,
They
said
video
it's
game our
like
misery.
a lot of times people's advice or their statements, like their like kind of moral platitudes, will be like, "Don't be assumptive." And
it's
that's
like,
what
that's
you hear.
not
Don't
the-
be judgmental.
Right,
Be
that's
nice. All of these things
Yeah,
are like,
Sandy, be
like be nice.
I
What
don't
is-
know what that means.
yeah, what does it mean to be nice?
Yeah.
In some situations,
I try.
being nice enables evil. So what does it mean to be nice?
It's just way more nuanced, and I think the
Yes.
nuance is what requires annihilating, right?
I
Yes,
don't even
that's
like
right.
the word nice.
Yeah, I mean, nice is
Come
the...
on now, be nice, Sandy.
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
What's the organization? There's like an
Sorry.
evil organization. Maybe it's in Lewis's space trilogy where Nice is the evil organization that takes over the world. Yeah, it is. It's the third book. Yeah, that's right. Nice. So yes, nice is not nice. But no, like love. Like when people are like, you should love. Like we should all love one another. Well, what is that? What does it mean to love? Right?
Love,
I mean,
yeah.
and so those like, for me, if we talk about like annihilating heuristic, like a kind of tool by which we go through situations. And that is deconstruction, as Derrida intended it, like a little tool where you go through situations and you deconstruct, the ways people think that are holding them back. Like a lot of, we've gone through, say, time, we've gone through memory and imagination, we've gone through desire, you're going through these different categories showing that annihilating principle is very much necessary so that we can affirm actuality. Because in actuality, there is no such thing as quote-unquote love. There's only particular manifestations of love. In actuality, there's no such thing as niceness. There's only particular situational ethics according to which niceness might manifest or not. And so annihilating these things can actually affirm reality.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that I don't know. Maybe people just don't want reality. That's why
They don't. No, they don't.
No, they don't. They
No,
absolutely
absolutely
don't.
not.
That's very true. They
That's
don't
why
want
they
reality.
They won't do the annihilating. They
And
won't
hence
accept
the whole
it.
illusions that we sort of create constantly that we keep
No,
creating.
But why do we create these illusions that are tormenting us? Like it's like such a tease.
It's a state of denial.
Yeah.
Well,
it's
you'd
true.
rather be tormented by something you feel like you have control over than,
Exactly.
liberated by something you don't understand.
Right.
But no, it's like in the
Here.
Burt Norton.
Poetry snaps.
Here, here.
Bongos.
I mean, T.S. Eliot in the Burt Norton with the Birdie says, man can never handle too much reality. And so, yeah, that's very true. We don't want reality. Well, because the moment you start saying that these categories are not objective, that in fact they're ultimately arbitrary, even if they're necessary, because the brain has to categorize to understand, then the question becomes the following. What are you going to do about it? And we don't want to be asked that question because we're trying to, go to our job, wake up, take care of our communities, and there's and you're basically saying, hey, all the categories by which you organize all of that are ultimately arbitrary, and you need to annihilate them to get to actuality. So, you want to do it? And you see, that's the thing. It's like. And this is the other thing. People don't even want to hear. Here's the key. People don't even want to hear the offer. Because once they hear the offer, they now have to respond to it. Like, once I say, hey, do you want to go to the movies? Mm-hmm. You are now a person who either chose to go to the movies or not. I have existentially transformed you just by asking you the question. And so you would rather it's like y'all the examples of dating. Like people will avoid people who they know might ask them questions they don't want to be asked so that they don't have to like face either.
No, that's you, Daniel, because
Yeah.
you're a hobbit.
Yeah, well, that
No,
is
just kidding,
definitely
just
me.
Like, not going to the movies.
Yeah,
They're just
definitely
they're just
not.
kidding.
But there's no good movies. Show me a good movie. I mean, I think that Everything, Everywhere, All at Once is apparently a masterpiece, so I have to see that. But it's not in the theaters. It's on YouTube or something.
But you're right about the avoiding because they
Yeah,
know that
because
they
you don't
might
even
get
want to
certain
be asked.
questions.
Like, people are like, oh, well, just, it's not so simple to say it's better to be given an offer than not. No. Being given an offer means you are now a person that responds to that offer.
Yeah,
And that
that's-
says things, so it's not so simple. So likewise, like, not only do we not want reality, we don't want to even be asked the questions that would give us the opportunity to get reality.
Why do you think?
Because we don't want to know what kind of person we are in response to even that inquiry. Like, how would we respond to even be asked about reality? Because if you're not asked about reality, you can, of course, live in plausible deniability that you don't deny reality. Like, that gives you kind of space to believe that you're
That
not
your illusions
avoiding
are
it.
reality?
Yeah, that's correct. And even if you, when asked directly, know to say, oh, I'm not certain, maybe my ideas are wrong, like, you know to say that when you're asked directly.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as you're not really on a deep existential level confronted with that possibility, you can exist in a plausible deniability where you mostly get it right. I would say that's how most people live. Like, if you ask most people, are you certain of their beliefs? They'll say no and genuinely mean it. But most people practically live as if they're like, yeah, no, I'm not 100% right, but I'm like 94. Most people see themselves at like...
99.99%.
Yeah, most people like see themselves as 94% right. But here's the thing, ideology needs that 66% because it would be like improper to believe that you are right about everything. So you are willing to accept that you're wrong about 6% of things so that you can believe that you're an open-minded person. But then that 6% actually has a key function of maintaining the invincibility of your ideology. So we all will necessarily claim that we don't think that everything we think is right, but by that, practically, that means 6% of what we think is wrong, and we give up that 6% so that we can cling to our ideology. So it has like a ventilation system.
The 6%.
Yeah, it's 6%. That's the official number, actually.
Is that the
Yeah.
official number?
Every ideology has 6% willingness of error so that it can maintain the 94% of correctness, of which practically functions as closed-mindedness. Yeah, that's how it works. It's 6%. That's the official number.
Right.
Yeah, it's in Hitchhiker's Guide, Galaxy, along with 42.
So do you think the rest... I mean, I always think
Is
about...
this in my 6% or 94 range? It will depend.
94.
Okay, it's in the 94.
now,
Okay,
Daniel.
good.
Do you think they sort of respond or react to reality?
Well, no. I mean, it depends on what we mean by reality, right? Is that going to be in your 94 or your 6%?
94, but because you could acknowledge reality or very much be in the reality, but do you react or respond to it?
That's a good question.
I don't have the answer at all to this question. The fine line between reacting and responding to life and
I mean, if anyone is still listening to this, then yeah, I mean, they deserve to listen to us go into another 3 hours on that distinction.
Oh, yes.
So, you're in
Yes.
it.
Oh, yeah, you
Uh,
do
The
deserve
night is
it.
young, as Sandy has been
Yes.
saying at 1 a.m.
She's
The
like,
night
every
is young.
night is like...
it's like 1 a.m. She's like, the night is young. Apparently, the night doesn't age. So
Sandy,
The wine doesn't.
the wine doesn't, so the night doesn't either.
Yeah.
The night is
Your
always
name
looking good.
means full moon, though.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
The night.
Sanduni's name means full moon.
Oh,
Yeah.
So
really?
the night is young.
Yes.
Oh, that's
So Sanduni
amazing.
means,
Full moon's great.
That's what it means in Sinhalese.
Wow.
Yes.
Oh, well, you're welcome in the headquarters anytime. With a name like that.
Daniel's like, I was
I wasn't
deliberating on it.
sure. But if that's what your name is, yeah.
I was sure since you're Sri Lankan.
Anytime.
Oh.
There's no
I've
problem.
always been
That
sure.
was fantastic. But I think so that would get into the difference where if we were to say react would be an object, like a ball's throwing at, someone throws a ball at your face and you like catch it, that's reacting. Where respond would be more like someone says, do you want to play baseball? And then you choose if you enter into a world full of objects like baseballs and mitts, where you are now playing baseball. So the question becomes, are people mostly reacting or are they responding? I would say that's the difference between cause and create. You know, where causation is, you know, just basic cause and effect, where create is new lines of cause and effect that wouldn't have arisen without the human element. And if the question is, do most people cause or create? I think all of us mostly are operating according to causality, but some of us may at key moments choose to create and go down a different line of causality that other people will not. And so we are mostly reacting. All human beings are mostly operating according to causation, but we can at key moments. And we can't respond, and we can create more than cause. But the issue is, to your question, I think it is natural to create less than more, because when you create, you then have to live with the existential questions of what you create and what if it's bad. If you just follow causation, if you just react, you can always claim it's not your fault. You know, it's not you. You were just going with the flow, and even if thing doesn't work out, there's a little bit of kind of like, well, it didn't work out, but you know, I was pushed along. The moment you start creating, balls in your court, baby. You know, and so what you gonna do? And that's quite difficult. Because the funny thing is, I mean, even like people who succeed. Like, you know, you can even look at like famous art, like if we just use an obvious example, like famous artists or whatever, like they're not necessarily happy, or they feel like they failed. So like, what does it even mean to succeed if you take the creative road? Like what is it even, like, what's the metric of having done the right course? It's not even clear. So that's another reason people avoid creation and responding, because it's not even clear what a successful, what constitutes success. You can say, well, being the person you wanted to be. Well, do you know what you want to be? That's part of the problem is precisely that you're creating what you want to be. You don't know what you want to be. You have to do it.
Yes.
And so it's very interesting. Yeah. So another reason people can just take the road of reacting is because the metric of success is clearer. You get, you know, the society says good job. Right. You know, because the society operates according to the reaction principle, the causal principle, and so you're like, I did a good job, I followed the track. You have a clear metric of success. Whereas with creation, it is existentially terrifying because you are responsible, and you don't even know what necessarily know if you use that responsibility well. So then you're just stuck with the terror. So, you know, that's why people avoid it.
Right.
Yeah, it's the creating is a type of responsibility, and it also requires deconstructing as well, right?
Yes.
And the idea of like you know, responding and reacting, you know, to kind of think about it, the way I think about it too is that respond is is so closely tied to the word responsibility, right?
Yeah.
React is like there's something.
Act.
Yeah, acting, just acting, and it's funny because a lot of times reacting happens when people are acting out, or kids are acting out, and you're reacting to their acting out, and
it's like chemical reaction kind of thing.
Oh, definitely, very
out of spite,
volatile.
Almost.
Yes.
It's very spontaneous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think maybe in some ways we kind of like can fall into that more so because it feels more, I don't know, it maybe it feels more like because it has to do with the acting. It's weird. I love the word acting. I think it's brilliant because there's a part of it that's a performance, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's kind of like you're acting means you're kind of putting on a show, right? But at the same time, acting makes you feel like you're taking action and you're doing something about stuff, and you're making sure people know that this is what's right or wrong, right? But it's like responding is kind of there's a way in which that takes a responsibility, right? The responsibility of sometimes pausing and actually having the, I think real encounters. I think reactions are often almost like just soundboards. Like it's just stuff is bouncing back and forth off of these notions of each other. Very volatile. Much more, in a sense, there's kind of a greater, I don't know, it's almost like more static or more, I don't know what. Maybe Sandy and I will joke with each other like, oh, why do we do these certain things, or like, why do we get fixated on illusions? Maybe it's just because we like chaos. Like we kind of get used to that feeling real or something. Like we associate that with it being more real or more lifelike. But yet at the same time, actually, if we are willing to again like annihilate, let that go, we find the true dynamicism, the true like I want to say like creative chaos, right?
Sure.
That there's chaos and creativity because there's this constant like deconstructing, reconstructing, right? And if we but that's a personal responsibility, and it's less you know, basically it takes a lot more kind of just you doing that, and kind of being able to sort of like pause and think about, oh, what should I say it or should I not? Whereas the other is just kind of like loud noises, and that kind of sounds like that feels like something more is happening. And we got into this with the debate discussion talk we did, Daniel. But anyways, just some thoughts coming to mind on react and respond.
And reacting is almost impulsive.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
oh yeah.
It's your first sort of, you think you're responding, but you're entirely personalizing the situation there.
Yes.
And a situation that sort of requires a reaction sometimes could involve more than one person or more than one situation. But when you react, it's completely self-centered. You know, it's like it's completely about you. Whereas when you respond, you sort of realize that perhaps the situation is bigger than the situation being mine. It's not so much about me as it is about the actual existing problem that needs my attention, or that it's something about me that sort of needs to be fixed.
Oh yeah.
Whereas with reacting, it's almost like you don't acknowledge that there is an issue within. You know, most of the
it's really
time,
important,
you
yeah.
think you're absolutely right, or
And
you
you're kind
don't
of-
see it. You
It's
know,
almost
you
like you're
genuinely
compelled.
be-
Oh, well, I just have to react this
You're
way.
probably
Yeah.
emotionally unaware of your own sort of, you know, vices that you just react. That's your impulsive inner child screaming, trying to reinforce a point. But oftentimes, even with a level of emotional intelligence, we tend to react. Why is that always easier to do than respond, is my question. And this is something I think about with my own actions and what triggers me in my day-to-day life, because I've always believed that, you know, how people treat us or what happens to us is out of our control. It's how we respond or what we do that it's in our control. And it takes a split second to respond versus react. But the outcome is entirely different. But
Yes.
even with a sense of self-awareness and emotional intelligence and all of this discussion, it's very difficult to know it in that very moment. Are we reacting or responding? You can't really tell the two apart. And I wonder why that is. I mean, I'm just leading to more questions here, but
No,
No, it's great. It's great.
I'm just trying to make sense of it, because I feel like, I mean, in most situations, I like to self-reflect.
Sure.
You know, what's the role I've played? Why have I done what I did the way I did? How could I do differently? Because I can't change you or you. I can only change myself.
Right,
Or
right.
I'm only in control of myself. I could advise someone. It's like taking the horse to the river to drink water, but I can't make him drink water.
Sure.
That's the same thing with ourselves, and the sooner we accept it, it makes things easier. But then again, I don't know, sometimes you're even guilt-driven about it. It could be a response, but you see it as a reaction. So how do you sort of make your peace with the two and sort of, you know, understand the very thin line that sort of leads to very two different outcomes?
No, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, reactions necessarily strike you in their appearance
Put it out.
as justified. You know, it's kind of tied to the problem of certainty. Like, they feel very real. Like, the
Yeah.
reaction feels justified. Like,
At the time.
at the
least.
time, it feels
Yes.
like it's almost dishonest not to do it in a
Yes.
way. Whereas a response, you know, well, the time you're taking to think about what you should say, the bad thing's getting worse, or you're not acting,
escalates.
and so like response feels like absconding your duty.
Yeah.
You know, where reacting feels like what you ought to do, like because it
Right.
feels like you ought to react this way necessarily, otherwise you wouldn't do it. And responding can feel like you're absconding your duty.
Right.
Because also there's a few more things, like I think our society, there's also kind of false humility in responding. Because
Yes.
it's like, hey man, I don't think I'm someone who knows all the answers, so I'm not going to think I'm someone who can respond, but I'm also like a person, so I'm going to react because this is wrong, or this is right, or whatever. So there's this way in which there's kind of an ethic. I think this is happening, certainly in America, where like where reacting is kind of like humble. And where if you want to respond, who do you think you are to respond? Like, who are you to think that you know what you're going on? So there's also a kind of like, that's another reason that kind of feeds things in the direction of reacting, because it's like, you know, what if I take all this time to think about it and just come up with a wrong answer? Whereas reacting often reacting is not philosophical. Reacting is like, well, I don't have to worry about being wrong in my reaction because the emotion, I'm just enacting the emotion. The emotion is very self-evident in its meaning. So it's like, I know I can be like authentic in the reaction.
So I have a question. Sorry to interrupt.
Please.
So would you say reacting is living in the moment?
Well, this is why but this is why stuff like being present is too
simple.
Too simple. Like, what's the difference between, well, you're just raw. Like, people are like, well, they're just raw and they're reacting and they're feeling. It's like, everything has to be annihilated. There always has to be an annihilating element in everything. And the other thing, I meant to say this earlier.
Yes.
There always has to be an annihilating element because there always has to be a dialectical element. Like, annihilation is the other side of dialectic. You make it if you're annihilating it, you're making it dialectical. You're adding a dialectical element. And so, basically, everything, always, everywhere, to reference a movie title that I haven't seen, and apparently it's amazing.
What's it called?
It's everywhere, everything, all at once. It's the main character is an Asian woman, and it looks amazing. It looks amazing.
So are you inspired?
It's supposed to be amazing. I've some people I respect who have not said there's been a good movie in years said there was a good movie, so I'm confused.
And is it new or?
It's newer, I would say, maybe 6 months old. I mean, it's not old. Anyway, everything has to entail an annihilating element, because everything has to be dialectical, because nothing is complete. Like, no value is complete. Freedom is not complete without justice. Justice is not complete without freedom. Emotion is not complete without thought. Thought is not complete without emotion. Nothing is complete because nothing is perfect. Everything is imperfect. Therefore, everything requires a dialectic. And if everything requires a dialectic, that means everything necessarily presents itself as complete. You experience freedom as all you need. You experience your emotion as all you need. Like, everything presents itself as if it's complete, and yet nothing is. And so everything has to be made dialectical, which means everything has to have its the feeling of completeness it brings annihilated. Like, the feeling that reaction is always justified has to be annihilated. Where instead you think in terms of, well, it's not that emotion is bad, because reaction tends to come from an emotional place, but emotion can be bad if it is not in service of truth, right? But then you also have to annihilate the idea that, like, truth is self-evident, right? And make it dialectical with the subjective reality, where then truth has to be sublimated into the absolute, which is Hegel, which always entails the subject. So everything always has to be, the way that everything presents itself as complete has to be annihilated, which then annihilation in this sense always leads to dialectics. The inclusion of the other that is being juxtapositioned with the initial premise that is then enhanced by that other. And so, so everything has to have an annihilating element. And so, like, when we're saying, like, oh, you should be present. Well, no, because you should also think about that if you're being present and you're in the moment saying, I hate you, your future may suck because the person you said I hate to will never talk to you again. So you were present, you are authentic, but you weren't thinking about the consequences. Like, we tell people all the time, like, we give people such confusing advice. We say, be present, but think about your consequences. Like, by definition, if you're thinking about the consequences, you are not present.
You're not present, exactly.
So basically, all advice is wrong. Like, every advice that you, like, basically everything you hear people say in the culture is wrong. Because culture is never dialectical. And what I mean by that is culture is structural.
Very contradictory.
I mean, culture is primarily a structure. If by culture we mean the socioeconomic order and everything that incubates. Structure is not dialectical by definition, it's solid.
Right.
And so culture is naturally not dialectical, which means it's wrong. Well, let's put it this way, it's incomplete. Right. And if any time an incompletion presents itself as complete, it's wrong. And so that's what society does. And so basically all the advice, everything you hear is wrong.
Great, Daniel. Thank you for passing.
This has been OG Rose at the headquarters.
Yes.
I just want a really quick comment. I promise it's quick.
It can be quick. It doesn't have to be quick.
No.
What's quick?
Yeah, what is quick? Annihilate that.
Quick?
Annihilate that.
Annihilate the heck out of that, please.
Yes.
But it's funny, we react, because we want a feeling of control, but actually we also are admitting that we can't control.
Yeah,
well,
that's
like
what's
I
so
can't
strange about it.
control the fact
Yeah,
that this
yeah,
should
yeah.
be the reaction, because it's just, of course, like that I should be this, I should feel this way, or so this weird control, control / uncontrol, or out of control or whatever. Whereas that same bothness is going to happen in response, right? Okay, you realize that it's actually is out of your control, but what you can control is maybe not how you feel about it, but how you respond.
Oh,
The bothness is always happening, so it's kind of a matter of like which is happening first. I have to think hard. I didn't think hard enough about
No, I mean,
that. But
reacting is like where you're summoning a force greater than yourself and you're using it on the other person.
well, and I don't even think you feel something. You're like you feel taken over by it. So
Yeah,
you're
that's what
kind
I'm
of
saying.
like,
Like, it's like this...
So you're
yeah.
like I can't really. It's not like my fault that I reacted that way.
That's
of course
right.
of course that had to happen. You
Yeah.
know, there's almost this kind of like, and that's why you can see it's so hyper concrete that it's obviously not allowing any annihilation in there at all.
Yeah, well, it's just another example where simplistic dichotomies will just simply not do. I mean, because humans often seek control by appealing to something uncontrollable. And they're often
Yeah,
like
that's a good way to put it.
and so like it tends to be that way. Like the other is included in the appeal to give it more grounding.
Sure.
Like because when you say like, well, I have something uncontrollable that I can unleash on you at any moment, so you better get your act together. There's like, I'm controlling you because I've told you there's like this uncontrollable thing in me that can come out in emotion, so you better get your act together. Mm-hmm. So it's like the unleashing. It's almost like Krishna showing Arjuna all his form. It's like, you better get your act together, Arjuna, because, I'll show you my true form. It's like there's a way in which that's what we're doing. It's almost like these like religious men. It's like, Moses, you get behind the cleft of the rock, man, because stuff might happen. And that's kind of what we're doing. So again, we have been taught to think, I guess to put it, like we've been taught to think in terms of opposites. Controllable versus uncontrollable.
Yeah.
Freedom versus determination. And that often
It's a bothness.
often it's a bothness and it at the very same time. Like it's a both the elements of control and uncontrol are always like operate in the act of seeking control.
Right, like that's why it's so good with your terminology, or the way you put it, punctuation, with punctuationally, is that a word? And like when you put like the the UN or the I am in parentheses, right?
Right.
The beginning, possible, like impossible. It's like there's a way in which possibility and impossibility are always working at the same time.
Yes.
And it's not a one or the other.
No.
It's not and this is very, very important to understand because it complexifies things. And yeah, we don't like the complexity, but actually we would do so much better with that because that's so much more in touch with reality, right? Like the complex.
Well, the whole entails its destabilizing element. Like, so when we talk about time, like at the very beginning, we were saying the present entails the future and the past. And the past isn't here and the future isn't here and it's present. So the present is always destabilizing itself. We were talking about like memory and imagination. Well, memory is always destabilizing because it is indistinguishable from imagination, except with subjects in the memory that kind of signal to you that this is imagined or it is not. So there's a destabilizing element at the heart of memory and imagination. Mm-hmm. There's a destabilizing element at the heart of freedom and determinism because you have to have determinacies by which give you being so that you can act freely. Mm-hmm. So the very thing that makes it possible for you to be free is a loss of freedom. So freedom is destabilizing itself. When you are reacting, you are appealing to something you have no control over to suggest that you should be acknowledged. So you are saying there's something that's kind of overriding you, which is evidence that you warrant being acknowledged. Every whole entails the destabilizing element that makes that whole not solid and not there. And you see, we've been just taught to believe that it's not that way. We've been taught to believe that there is opposites, and if you choose the right side of the opposite, you're good to go. It's either a choice of determinism or freedom, and reality is either determined or free, so what's the right side of the opposite? And then you have arguments about, well, determinism's true. Then you have arguments that freedom is true, and then the name of the game is to figure out what is the right side of the opposite. And so that's what education is. Figuring out, and there's in all debate. Here's I guess what I'm getting at. Like all debates are basically processes of figuring out the right side of the opposite, and people don't agree on what is the right side of the opposite. But the schema of conversation is in terms of there is a right side of the opposite, as opposed to the whole entails a destabilization of itself. Which is a very different idea, that there's not a right side. There is a situational condition that you have to maintain awareness of and move with and see in its dynamic operation so that it does not efface you, as opposed to annihilate you into a sublation. That is much different than believing that if you can figure out the right side of the opposite and hold to it, your life will be great. Because that's basically how we say, it's like, okay, once you go through the debates, you're going to choose what side of the opposite it is. Free will or determinism. Past, present, or future. You're going to choose. And if you choose the right one, you're good to go. That's basically how we talk. We talk about education, that like if one day you'll have to choose what side of the opposite it's going to be.
Exactly.
And if you choose the right one, life will be grand. That's what we're led to believe. That's not the case at all. Everything is part of wholes, of which entail their destabilizing element. Therefore, the word for that I like to use is whole with the W in parentheses. Right. That every whole has a hole in it. And H-O-L-E, yes. Like every hole has a hole in it. And yes. So the moment you establish a hole, you create an H-O-L-E, so you have to try again. And then do it again, and do it again, and do it again, and do it again. There is always a destabilization. Whatever you do entails its own destabilization. Well, that's very different from how you've been taught in terms of opposite schemas that then set you up for failure. Because life isn't something that operates according to opposite schemas. Life is something that operates according to wholes with the W in parentheses. And so education sends you out into the world to fail. Because it sends you out into the world to pick the right side of an opposite in a world where there isn't opposites, there's only destabilization. And you go out looking for stabilization in a world that's going to take it from you quickly.
Sorry, left out, Daniel, with the massage.
That's all right. I'm destabilized.
But,
so I'm actually more whole with the W in parentheses than you two. Because,
Are you sure?
Because I am lacking something to remind me. I'm not sure. No, that's why I
Right.
So it's an H-O-L-E hole in different things like that.
Yeah.
No, we're basically set out into the world to fail. Because we are set to think in terms of picking the right side of opposites, which then means we don't train ourselves to be ready for destabilization. And then when that destabilization occurs, because we did not habituate ourselves to be anti-fragile, rather than the destabilization make us stronger, as it were, it would if we were anti-fragile, like Nassim Taleb talks about. Yeah. Instead, we go out and we're fragile, and then we get shattered.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, this has been a great talk, girls. I'm glad we could, Sandy, I was so glad you could make it to the headquarters.
Thank you very much for having me in the headquarters.
Oh,
the pleasure's mine and the honor.
So this is...
Oh, it's our pleasure and honor.
This is literally where we do OG Rose Conversations.
Yes.
At this hour as well, actually.
Yes.
So the time...
live from headquarters/studio.
So this is a live, real life, whatever that means, because we have to destabilize the element. So this has been OG Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com and Twitter and Anchor and Facebook and Deerhaven and Farm and Google GPS. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sandy and Daniel.